Satoshi couldn't have written a better script, having it hit a new all-time high on the night of the election. I think one of the most important things is we have the first Bitcoin president.
The first Bitcoin president of the United States, President Donald Trump, to being the Bitcoin president. Let's have a listen to this full interview.
Take a look at crypto this morning. We have already a few times here with us now, getting after it relentlessly, right? Anthony Pompliano, founder and CEO of Professional Capital Management. And you're always in a positive mood. Even though crypto is not always positive, it is this morning. You expect more new highs on Bitcoin.
I mean, new all-time high. Satoshi couldn't have written a better script, having it hit a new all-time high on the night of the election. And I think one of the most important things is we have the first Bitcoin president. President Trump ran on a campaign point that he was going to protect Bitcoin. He was going to create a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And I think that you saw Bitcoin's price kind of reflect having somebody who was so pro-Bitcoin win the White House.
So relatively, it's not that recent, I guess. But so you think this is the real Donald Trump on Bitcoin that he's been for the last, how long, a year and a half?
I think that he's surrounded by enough people who really understand this. You know, people like Bitcoin Magazine CEO David Bailey, many others who have really spent the time with him. And one of the interesting things is whether he believes in Bitcoin or not is almost a moot point. Is what is he going to do? And if he's going to protect it and not be abrasive, that's a win. But if he also creates the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, I think that'll be a huge tailwind, and it'll kick off this global game theory, right? If the United States starts to lean in and welcome Bitcoin and say, hey, this is an asset that we want on our balance sheet, other countries are going to have to respond. And the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it's been a bottoms-up adoption story. Individuals adopted it first. Now we see corporations and financial institutions. But the central banks are some of the biggest buyers of gold. Gold is up huge. And so if central banks start to buy Bitcoin and put it in their reserves, that would be a massive tailwind for Bitcoin.
So even short of a sovereign wealth fund or anything like that, Andrew, Becky, we haven't talked about Gary Genslar in light of what's going on.
You mean that he's not going to have a job?
You tell me.
Of course he's not going to have a job.
What
do we need to talk about here?
We know who's not going to be SEC commissioner.
I can tell you who's not going to be the SEC commissioner. I can tell you who's not going to run the FTC. Yeah. I can tell you who's not going to, right? I can go through the list.
Yeah.
It's going to be a house cleaning, obviously.
Mark Cuban is not going to be if he wanted to be at this point. You think Genslar's gone, and you think that would be good?
I think people expect whenever a new president comes in, they're going to, kind of play musical chairs with all the regulatory organizations. What I do think we are on the precipice of is a kind of an economic explosion. Right, we have somebody who's coming in who obviously is very business friendly. He's surrounded by people who are very business friendly. They have some radical ideas in a positive way in terms of what they can do to cut taxes, drive GDP growth, use the country's balance sheet to try to close the deficit gap. And so I don't expect them to be able to do everything that they're saying that they can do. Right, when you're on the campaign trail, you say a lot of stuff. But if they can accomplish 50% of it,
so which 50%? Like, which are the ones that you think are most important and maybe most likely to get put through?
Well, I think actually, if you look at what the American people did last night, they basically issued a mandate. They said, we want lower inflation, we want affordable housing, we want a secure border, we want a government that doesn't go and engage in more war, and we want to feel like we are safe, secure, and strong at home. And so if you are the president coming in and you can say, how do I get inflation down and under control? If you look at home affordability, start to deregulate and allow people to build more housing in this country.
Right, because the problem is not giving people $25,000 to say you can go ahead and buy a house. The problem is creating more supply.
For a minute, I thought you were pitching the inflation trade. You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. All these things that he's going to do with tariffs and cutting taxes and, not
all
taxing
good for Bitcoin.
Yeah, all good for Bitcoin because of inflation. Then you just said he's going to bring inflation down. I don't know who I believe. I don't know which part of you I believe.
I think there's a difference between skyrocketing inflation and currency debasement, right? And the currency debasement is why Bitcoin goes up. Inflation is usually happens alongside with it.
Isn't it?
It's not in the sense that you can have the currency continue to debase and lose purchasing power without having that inflation number spike to 9%. Right, and I think that's what we really saw here was we saw inflation spike over 9% during the Biden administration.
So what do you think it should be? 5%, 6%, 7%?
I tend to think that the inflation rate is not 2%. It's higher than that, but it's not going to be 5 to 10%.
Do you think the Fed goes along with that? If they start to see inflation picking back up, wouldn't the Fed then raise rates? And wouldn't that have wouldn't that curb inflationary economic expansion?
One of the biggest questions I think that we're going to face as a country is how involved should the president and the executive branch be involved in monetary policy. Donald Trump has said that he thinks the president should be more involved. We obviously have had a situation where the central bank has been independent.
You think inflationary stuff and then saying we're going to keep rates going down, interest rates going down is the right policy?
I don't think that you can keep rates going down if inflation is spiking. And so I think that's where you get a lot of complexity. And it's not as clear in terms of when inflation is spiking, what do you do to get it down?
And by the way, the bond market isn't paying attention to the Fed lowering rates at this point anyway, not on the long end, not even on the short end at this point. But the 10-year is all the way back up at 447. So there's only so much that any administration or any Federal Reserve can do.
Yeah, one of the things that's really interesting about policy is you kind of draw, the perfect playbook, right? You're like, hey, this is the theory of what could happen. But then that plan meets the real world. And so you can try to do all these things.
Like Mike Tyson, right? You can do all these things till somebody punches you in the face.
Yeah.
What if that person punching you in the face is the bond market?
And it's also a very complex system. So you say, hey, I'm going to go get home affordability down. Okay. Or you go and you do that. As soon as you do that, all of a sudden inflation spikes somewhere else. You got to go and you try to address that. Then asset prices crash, right? And so you're just constantly
incentivizing people to build more housing supply. That seems like the right way to go at it.
And one of the questions I think with housing supply is how much is the president and the national government able to do that versus is it local governments? One of the things that I say is for your investment portfolio, the Federal Reserve chairman is more important than the president. But for many Americans, actually, who's on their local city council may be more important than who's in the White House.